So, my topic was deaf culture and media, and I just wanted to touch on the topics of how it all got started and how we've evolved from then until now. And I basically threw out the different things that happened between the 1950s all the way up to 2019. Um, and just to kind of start off um, with the deaf culture and how I feel like it's come along so much compared to us discriminating against somebody who can't hear you. Now, these days, we have actors and um, producers and directors who are deaf. We even have world famous supermodels who are deaf. Um, that being Niall DeMarco. And he is fantastic, and he won America's Next Top Model. I've had the honor of meeting him and being able to, hear his story and know that it's not easy. It's never been easy, and that's okay. Um, so there's a couple things from my paper that I did want to touch on, and that's how popularity in the 1950s came to mainstream with deaf television. And that's when they kind of started a law against discriminating against deaf people and also making sure that they were included. So, not just not having subtitles, but also making it easier for them to, understand or not hear, but, be able to go to a movie theater and be included instead of wondering what the person is saying or wondering, what's actually happening right now. Um, so there was another thing that I saw, and that was that they experimented in 1971 with the first national conference on television for the hearing impaired. Now that's a really big, that's a really big deal. And then after that, opening caption was created, where in 1972, a program called The French Chef was broadcasted on PBS, and that was the first show made accessible for deaf people. And then going into 1973, ABC TV became broadcasted with captions, and then 1979, a program called Signs of Our Times. Now, that is pretty cool considering the fact that that show basically taught you sign language. And it was a 40-minute show, I believe, where they taught you a bunch of different signs all throughout, from beginner signs all the way to somebody who's been signing for years. And I think it's really great that people kind of got to learn a new side of a language. And when I say language, I mean not language as in speaking language. I'm talking about facial expressions, and I'm talking about talking with your hands and not using your voice mostly. Be the fact that in sign language you don't have to use your voice is amazing. I mean, you use your facial expressions, you use your hands, you use body language, but it's never with your voice. And I think it's very important that people understand that it's a whole different way of communicating, and it's amazing. Um, and then we go into silent networking, which expanded into 2 million homes in 1981. Imagine 2 million homes. And then it went into 14 million homes later on, 9 years later. In 9 years, it went from 2 million to 14 million. That's a huge number and a huge difference. And then we go into television shows besides The French Chef and besides Signs of Our Lives, of Our Times, to the show, one of my favorites, called Switched at Birth. Now, Switched at Birth was a show which started, I believe, in 2011, and it lasted, I think it was maybe like 6 seasons or 7 seasons. And basically, the show was about these two girls who got switched at birth. And one of them became deaf, and then they just so happened to meet because one of the girls didn't believe that her parents were her parents. And she was right. She was switched. She found her real mom and dad. And then she realized now she has a sister who's technically not really biologically related to her at all, but they became sisters and they became best friends, and she learned sign language, and one of the sisters that was deaf went to an all deaf school, and then she went to Gallaudet, which is a great university for deaf people. And then it kind of went on from there, which I think is amazing, and it shows you the struggles that people go through when you're deaf and how people will discriminate against you for not being able to hear them or not being able to communicate in the way that they want you to communicate. Just being around that or learning about it, you see it's not just people of color, or it's not just somebody who just doesn't look like you. They may be too fat or too short. It's people who can't hear you, people who have accents, anybody. They can all be discriminated against. But I also know now that with how it is then and how it is now, things are changing. Like I said, we have deaf producers and deaf directors. And I think it's amazing that that can kind of happen. I already talked about Kyle DeMarco. And like I said, he has made a pathway. I mean, so many other people have too, but to become one of the first actual deaf supermodels like in the world, that's a big thing. Another thing that happened was the silent era. So they called it the golden era of deaf community, and it was from 1893 to 1929, and it was a time, let me read it so I can make sure I say it exactly how it is. It was the only time that a deaf or hard of hearing citizen could sit with hearing audience in a darkened movie theater and enjoy the drama or comedy without the need for a third-party interpreter, special captions, elaborate sounds, or any other assistive devices, which means they didn't need their hearing aids. They didn't need somebody to sign to them to tell them what was going on. They didn't need, anything like that to help them. They used to have these extra big sound speakers. I lost the word. And they used to have extra reverb on them so you'd be able to feel it a little better, or you'd be able to hear it. Not everybody is completely 100% deaf. You have people who can hear 10%. And you could have people, one of my friends, she's only 70% deaf. So she can hear as long as it's super, super, super loud, she can hear it. But she still doesn't speak. She still considers herself deaf. She still has hearing aids. There's other things in here that ended the golden era, and that was a talkie. And a talkie is an informal term for film incorporating synchronized audible dialogue rather than readable text. Now, the terms were widely used in the 1920s and the early 1930s to distinguish sound from silent film, which it killed the silent films because of what it did with the sound and with no more closed captions, no more anything like that to kind of keep inclusive with deaf culture. And that was a big turn in the ages. Taking a look at the law that they created, I do want to touch on that, and I do want to say that the purposes of the law that I did put in my paper, in one of the laws, I'm sorry, my cat kind of freaked out a little bit. The first law was to bring deaf persons' understanding and appreciation of those films which play an important part in the general and cultural advancement of hearing people. The second part is to provide through these films enriched educational and cultural experience through which a deaf person can be brought into a better touch with realities of their environment. And then the purposes of the law, not just why the law was created, was to acquire films, provide for captioning, provide for distribution. It's a pretty big deal.